Well, good morning all. Anchored at Dale in Milford Haven, just waiting for the winds to get a bit lighter before I do my long passage down to Padstow, probably leaving about 1 o'clock in the morning tomorrow, and then arriving in the evening at high water. So I'm anchored here just next to this nice sort of cliff and covered in trees. It reminds me a bit of some of the shores of Lake Malawi, like on the Malaris, where you have a rocky shoreline with dense trees coming down and doves cooing. The only thing we're missing here is the fish eagle. So the long-awaited anchor discussion, which Matt requested a few weeks ago, and there's no topic likely to cause more controversy and discussion and opinions on boating forums than anchoring. So yeah, when you're anchoring, you're essentially attaching the boat to the sea floor so it stops moving, and you want to do that in a way that it allows for the conditions you have when you anchor, but also how they may change over the next period, next day. As the tide comes in and out, the water gets deeper and shallower, the wind changes direction, etc. And you want to really anchor so that you can sleep at night without worrying. You can go ashore and leave the boat on its own safely. So there are a few things, aspects to that you can do to make it as good as possible, and we'll go through them. So just to start with, I've drawn a couple of pictures to show you some of the aspects of anchoring, some of the technical terminology and so on. So here we go. Yeah, so this is the sea floor, the bare seabed and the water, and here's Mwera sitting on anchor, and you can see the anchor is here, and then here we've got what's attaching the anchor to the boat, which may be chain or rope or both, but in sailing terms it's called the rode, the anchor rode, whatever's attaching the boat to the anchor. And here I've got part chain, and then a dotted line is rope. You can have all rope, which is rubbish, or you can have all chain, which is probably the best. On Mwera I've gone for a mixture. And the other thing to talk about here is the scope of the anchor, which is as important or more important than whatever anchor you have on the end of it. So the scope is the length of your anchor line as a ratio of the depth of the water from the bow to the seabed. And what you want is that to be as long as possible. So maybe here it's 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. And the ideal scope might be 1 to 5, even 1 to 7, depending on the conditions. If you have a very short scope like here, you can see that this anchor will just be pulled out of the seabed. Anytime a wind gusts or a big wave comes and pushes the boat, it will just jerk this anchor out of the seabed and you'll be floating off. So the longer your scope, or the bigger your scope, the more you have a horizontal part of the rode here which is pulling horizontally on the anchor. That's what you're aiming for. And whether you use chain or rope, chain is heavier, so it hangs down more, and the shape of this curve for mathematicians is called a catenary curve. That's the shape something flexible that's hanging takes up, and you want that catenary curve to be much more shallow. So more chain, if you have chain all the way, you're more likely to have a nice sagging line with a horizontal pull on the anchor. More chain is then more weight in the bow of the boat. So sometimes you do part chain and part rope to get around that. You can also increase the holding power by adding a weight to your rode, which is called a chum or an angel or a killit, or so many different names. And this, you sort of hook this onto your thing and onto your rode and let it slide down, and it basically makes this part of the rope more horizontal. So that is some of the aspects of how you set up anchoring. And what you do when you're anchoring is generally you're motoring or going into the wind or into the tide, which is a more controlled way of coming to a stop. And as you get to the point where you want to drop your anchor, your boat is lost anyway. It just stops, and you drop your anchor, noting what the depth is at that point. And then as the boat starts to fall back with the wind pushing it back or the tide, you feed out your anchor chain so it doesn't all land on top of the anchor and tangle up, but it just lies out on the seabed as you fall back until you've got the required amount. And often I go for about 5 to 1, and it depends on a variety of things. And if it's like the other night when I got into Solva during the night, I could feel it was getting windier and rougher, so I went out and just let out a whole load more, so I had about 7 to 1 just for peace of mind. Of course, there are lots of different types of anchors. There's the traditional fisherman's anchor, which is the sort of picture of an anchor that everyone can draw, and then the typical classic one that's been, like boats like this came with, it's called the CQR, and that was very popular. And there's a Danforth, there's a whole variety. Nowadays there's a sort of newer generation which all have the feature of having a roll bar, so that when they land on the seabed, the top of the anchor has a roll bar, a curved bar on it, and then the blade of the anchor is weighted to be quite heavy. So if it lands upside down on the roll bar, it will just roll over until the tip of the anchor hits the seabed, and then it will start digging in. So I've actually gone for a Rocna anchor this time, just because they're better at holding than my CQR. The other thing that makes a big difference to anchoring is the bottom of the sea, the seabed. So on the east coast rivers you have a lot of glutinous mud, which will suck almost anything into itself for anchoring purposes, and it's usually reluctant to give your anchor back again. So that's probably the most secure thing to anchor in. And then you can have sand, like here. It's a quite nice sand. Quite a lot of the anchorages in the west coast of Scotland had a lot of kelp on the sea floor, which just stops the anchor from digging in, and you maybe have 2 or 3 goes of getting the anchor to set, and just slipping, and you pull it up and there's lots of weed and you try again. As you're going into an anchorage, you can spot areas where the water changes colour, and you can tell that it's sand underneath, and then you drop your anchor there, and then even if there's kelp around that place, it doesn't matter because your anchor is holding in the sand. The other sort of difficult bottoms are things like gravelly, stony bottoms where the anchor can't really dig in very well. So when I'm anchoring, I tend to sort of, as I say, you come up into the wind or into the tide and drop the anchor, and then you fall back slowly. And when you think you've got enough anchor rowed out to your 5 to 1 scope, you tie it off on the cleat at the bow, and then the boat will then sort of drift backwards and swing around a bit, and suddenly it sort of jerks tight, and you know that the anchor's held in the bottom and the boat suddenly is sort of pulled into a straight line. That's a very satisfying feeling. And then I then put the engine in reverse and slowly go up to about middle revs to dig the anchor into the ground. And you sort of line up 2 points on the shore and see them in a straight line, then you watch them as you go in reverse and see if that straight line is preserved or if you're falling back relative to the shore, in which case you have to try again. I remember getting into Loch at Cadfrey, right, my first anchorage after Cape Wrath, and I had to have 4 or 5 goes to get the anchor to set. Every time I went in reverse it just pulled out again. So I think that's most of the issues around anchoring. The other thing you can think about is that when it's very windy, the boat will really swing around quite violently sometimes, and you get very hard jerks on the anchor which can then tear it out of the bottom. So you can set up a snubber, which is an elastic line which will absorb those shocks and make it less likely to rip the anchor out, and also more comfortable. So I have a line which is some stretchy rope which has got some hose pipe on it to stop it chaffing on the fairly where it leaves the boat, and then I attached that today to a long stretch of climbing rope all the way back to the stern, and as the wind blows, that whole bit of climbing rope stretches and absorbs the shock. It's also more comfortable on the boat if you do that. Good, so I think that's about all. Yeah, let's wait the discussion.